welcome everyone, and thank you for coming along to this next talk in our Professoriate lecture series. I'm delighted this evening to be able to introduce Professor Stuart Marsden. Stuart is Professor of Conservation Ecology, and his work focuses on how human activity and land conversion actually impacts life, often by a land use change. He works pretty much all over the globe, as far as I can tell, and on a variety of species, from amphibians, cats, primates, but most especially on tropical birds. His research has resulted in the change of conservation status for a large number of species, and in some cases for policy changes on the use of entire habitats. And a key aspect of his work that he likes to make sure is pointed out is his desire to include capacity building in his research, especially when it takes place in developing countries. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Professor Stuart Marsden.
Thank you very much, Richard. First of all, can everyone hear me? Going to be wandering around nervously and sort of just chattering away. Maybe opportunities for people to talk as well. Please do heckle. You know, so like yeah, in the nicest sort of way. I think if there's any subject that heckling is due, it's this one. It's also, as Richard was saying, it's quite a big part of my work, but I do some other things. But I chose this for this lecture really because it does more than, I suppose, it says on the tin. From a conservation point of view, we're really interested in the species and the species extinctions or whatever, but it tells us a lot more about the world around us and the sorts of people that we are. Even looking at the verbs used in association with direct exploitation, I as a scientist would, in a rather sterile way, call it direct exploitation of wildlife rather than secondary sort of problems. But if you look down at those verbs used to describe it, there's a lot of emotion in some of those. Not a lot of emotion in the words, but they should be words that generate some emotion amongst us. Hunting and trapping, you know, we don't like to be trapped. Do we like to be harvested? I think harvesting is quite a popular word, but it also suggests that we've got some sort of justification or legitimacy in doing that, whether we've planted a crop that we can go on and harvest, or even if it's just believing in a God that delivers us of this sort of bounty. Poaching conjures up quite a different sort of view. Who are the archetypal poachers in the world? We would say, what?
Working class people trying to subsist.
Okay, that was going to be my second one. I think the first one's more of a wild thornberrys type poacher, an African poacher, a baddie who's taking wild animals and ivory and rhinos from the wild. A very different sort of poaching is the sort of poaching that goes on and has gone historically within this country. Yeah. I always deliver this lecture to students, and one of the students said, yeah, well, we've got poachers round our way in Glossop. They go and tase a sheep on the moors. That's just awful. Those friends of yours, isn't it? It's working. It's just an awful thing. But poaching, sort of, we think of illegitimacy. We think of illicit, illegal activities, whether they be by big gangs or by very rich people or by poor people poaching pheasants, salmon, deer, sheep, etc. Off-take culling. Culling is a sort of thing that's got a scientific legitimacy. We're almost killing individuals for the good of the population. We've sort of got a scientific legitimacy around doing it. So there's phrases for talking about exploitation of wildlife. It's not a thing that is new to us. It's very big in the news at the moment, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it's been around since people have been around. The megafaunal extinctions, we've got a moa there, but it could be a mammoth, or it could be many of the big mammals, birds, reptiles that existed up to 5,000 years ago, 2,000 or 15,000 years ago. There's a very cliched picture of a Wild West guy standing on what? Bison skulls, yeah, due to be ground down for fertilizers, etc. in the Wild West. The middle image, everybody should see the video of the last thylacine, or the last Tasmanian tiger that died in Melbourne Zoo in 1934. 36 or 34, I was a bit uncertainty there. I thought it was 1922 myself, but recently enough to have a video of it pacing up and down and jumping up at the bars when the keeper brought in his dog. This was an exploitation to extinction brought about by government policy in Tasmania to actively get rid of this beast. Yeah, so it was a bounty on these delicious animals. They were seen as vermin and they were hunted to extinction. Next one along is not the CEB Tanzania field trip from a long time ago. It is a hunting party of rich whites in East Africa. Yeah? Don't know why that's there. It's sort of quite an interesting image anyway. But if we look at conservation in East Africa, or in many parts of Africa, it's very much driven by colonial rule. Yeah, these national parks, as we see today, were the playgrounds of the rich, and they were there, as they were in India, as hunting reserves for rich people to go on safari and take game. Okay? They've evolved from that. The two species on the right, a reminder that these things can... Sorry? I guess you mean no, I was just checking that the top one's the pigeon, isn't it, and the bottom one's the parakeet. Yeah. Two very famous extinctions of birds, again from North America, showing how quickly human actions can extirpate a species. Yeah, the passenger pigeon, variably described as perhaps one of the most abundant species ever to live on the planet, or in our kind of epoch or whatever, but hunted very quickly to extinction. As well as those sort of classic extinctions and looking back in history, we look to even times when I was a kid and we had our first colour TV. Those images of seal slaughters or culls or whatever were, when colour telly first came in, were very powerful images that both brought the horrors of the world and wildlife to people's doorsteps, but also generated so much interest in environmental issues and conservation issues. So those poor seals have worked hard, I think, for changing people's attitudes to the way that we look at the exploitation of wildlife, in the same way as they drove bans in, or general bans in, whale harvesting across the world. It's also a really interesting subject because it's quite a dynamic sort of thing. That's a picture of a young David Attenborough who used to collect butterflies. Apparently they're in his loft, which is quaint, but he used to collect butterflies, and his first appearances on TV were in a series called Zoo Quest, where he went to exotic places and stole animals for London Zoo. Yeah? And now he's turned the tide, and he's now probably the most famous environmental or biology, wildlife presenter that there's probably ever been. Whatever. These things are ongoing. we see now the image there of Chris Packham. He's in Malta, fighting against the devastating sort of hunting of migrant birds in that part of Europe. Right, the battle lines are drawn in that issue, like they are in many of these sort of cases. The people versus the whales, the whaling, people against all sorts of exploitation. In that case, conservationists versus hunters. And I think, in a way, and we'll get to that later on, it's not necessarily a helpful conflict. It makes us feel great about it, but the battle lines are drawn, and when they are drawn, then compromise and realistic sort of pragmatic solutions seem to go out of the window. I got into trouble a bit ago by sort of saying, well, the two sides are so polarised and they're so aggressive towards each other. I said one side is full of aggressive bigots and the hunters aren't that much better either. Yeah. Oh. So it's a very dynamic sort of thing. But it's also an issue that cuts to the heart of what we are and what we feel. The last two images there, the left-hand one is a trophy hunter, yeah? A rich person who has paid a lot of money to kill a cheetah. The right-hand guy is a research biologist who's tranquilized, probably shot as well, an ocelot in Central America, but they both got the same looks on their faces. They're both proud enough of what they've done to appear on social media with an immobilized animal in front of them. And that's quite a key sort of thing when we're looking at this sort of issue. I use this, and forgive me, please, the people who've seen it either once or twice, the students that are here. I show this to third-year students and master's students at the beginning of a lecture on wildlife exploitation. And the whole idea, sometimes it takes up most of the class. People just looking at those images and me asking them what they think about those things. Okay? I think it's a very useful teaching tool of linking your research or whatever, or research stories to teaching, because everybody has got their own opinion about it. And I think I don't teach a class where I get 90% of the students in the class actually talking. And I think in educational terms, that is a fantastic way of getting people involved in the class, give them ownership of it, and getting them to enjoy the learning experience. And what I say to them is, you've got a magic wand and you can stop one of those exploitations happening. You've got, in return for stopping that trade or that exploitation, you've got to turn a blind eye to another one that you find most acceptable in the world. Okay? And it takes a long time, and a lot of people have got a lot of opinions about it. And maybe it's useful, and will take up time because I haven't got too much material, to explore this sort of thing here. First question that I suppose I'd ask, which one would you choose, Nigel? I'm presuming we're going to know which one you find most acceptable and which one. I'm assuming.
Oh, there goes the end of a nice relationship. Well, this is Sophie's choice multiplied by whatever it is, 10. And it's just impossible to do this with a good conscience. I mean, it's a very unfair question. It's a completely unreasonable question as well, really.
Okay.
So
it's been a long day I've spent with you. Conserving birds.
Doing our best. But some people would say...
Can we have somebody else? Rachel. Yeah, go on, sorry, no.
No, some people would say that the most important thing is to make the exploitation in question sustainable. So you might go, if you think, well, you can make something sustainable, that would not be a bad thing to do. But sustainability, if it involves the permanent torture of an animal, like the one in the bottom left, the bear bone, if that's going to be permanently tortured, how can I possibly live with my conscience for choosing something else, or the macaque in the top right?
Okay.
So you're asking a totally impossible question. I'm backing out of answering.
Okay, well, it was a long answer, a long non-answer. Does everyone know what these sort of things represent? The top one is fishing or overfishing. The second one is bycatch of dolphins with sea bass fishing and or whatever. These are accidental killings of animals that aren't even the target of things. The bottom one, as Nigel said, was bear bile. It's basically farming. It's a cross between farming like we do and the draining of blood from cattle that Maasai folk do in East Africa. Moving across, we've got a Papua New Guinean guy wearing birds of paradise feathers. Going up, we've got trophy hunting in South or Central Africa, where rich guy has spent a lot of money killing that cheetah. We've got rhino slaughter at the top, bear dancing for tourists in India. The bottom one, of course, is a Nemo fish. And we've got fur coats, rosewood, or the harvest of valuable timber. And then the top right one is a monkey for medical or other experiments or whatever. Any advance on Nigel's simpering?
How old is the macaque?
How old?
Photograph? I mean,
why do you ask?
Well, it just occurs to me that if we are going to experiment on animals like that, that we might have moved on since the photo was taken, that we might have more humane way to do it, perhaps.
Okay.
I don't know how old the photo is. You see, that's my query.
We're both older than most people in here, so we've got to be a little bit careful. But yeah, yeah, I think we could have moved on, but I was just saying to Nigel before, I was in quite a useful conservation meeting in Indonesia a few months back, and a very well-respected and powerful Indonesian conservationist was talking about an area of land, like a national park, that they wanted to increase the amount of money generated by that national park. I suppose if you're a developing country and people impose a big national park and say that's for the animals, keep out, then you're always looking at ways in which to make money to help the economy of your country and the livelihoods of individuals. And the guy said, one of the ideas we've had is to harvest macaques from the national park and sell them for medical experiments. I thought that was quite a strange thing to hear in a conservation meeting, but was I right to think that? I was a bit purist about they're basically taking baby macaques and selling them for medical experiments abroad within their conservation unit and whatever. It's a strange sort of situation, and it's a hard thing to really grasp what's right and what's wrong in those sort of cases. Anybody think it's totally okay? So it kind of strikes a chord, really. Tom, right or wrong?
If it's sustainable, then why not?
Okay, all right.
We need cancer drugs and stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Great.
We were threatening to come to me earlier, so I thought I'd get you back on track.
Okay.
And the one I would stop is the overfishing.
Okay.
I think in pretty much every other case except the bycatch, it would be the fishing and the bycatch.
Okay.
You could reach a pragmatic trade-off solution where you also delivered conservation goals, except in that one.
Okay.
That's the only one way you can.
The macaque in the park is an introduced species, so it shouldn't actually be there. that might change a little bit. And it doesn't change the hardest of hearts, but should do. I think Rachel's right. I think the top left and the bottom right are the ones that the students least often point out. And perhaps in a way that shows, and the whole point of the exercise, I think, is to show how much baggage, emotional baggage, we bring to these sort of debates. We talk about overfishing. Overfishing is something, it's also something that's done by us, which doesn't really help in demonising these sort of issues. The trade in tropical timber is huge and extremely damaging. We don't see the animals falling out of the trees or struggling behind bars, but they don't survive nonetheless, or have the point. Anybody pick in another one that they would get rid of?
Trophy hunting.
The what?
Trophy hunting.
Trophy hunting.
Yeah.
Acceptable or not acceptable?
Not acceptable.
Okay. Anybody got that as the most acceptable? Yeah. Oh. Why?
The animals get a reasonable life for the duration of their lives, and you can probably do it reasonably sustainable.
Okay. Tom. Tom, meet Ollie. Get along just fine. Yeah, that's right. Perhaps any other argument for that? Rach, I've stirred a hornet's nest up there.
I would say that's what, you know, people will pay big money and they want large areas conserved in order to have a supply of big game that they could go and hunt. I'm not saying I'm for it,
Yeah.
I'm just saying you could see a mechanism there where you can leverage money to help maintain those populations.
And that's the whole point of it, I suppose. It's that it's trophy hunting which forms a sort of mainstay of conservation efforts throughout quite big parts of the world, especially in southern Africa. The campfire scheme, etc. They're built into conservation plans where individual communities set quotas for rich and perhaps crazy and people with too much money to come in and trophy hunt these things sustainably, and that money is redirected, we hope, to schools and clinics and other development goals. Costa? Nothing. What, nothing goes to those development goals, or nothing to say?
Nothing to say really, other than trophy hunting, and as you say, it might justify some income, but it legitimizes a completely wrong value of wildlife and of people's relationship with wildlife. It still is a dominatory paradigm that says still we humans can go and take wildlife, so long as we pay big enough, then we're justified to do it. So I think that's morally not as justified, is morally more unjustifiable with some of the other things. Because overfishing, at the end of the day, you need to do it to feed people, whereas hunting, trophy hunting, you just do it for the vanity of it.
So conservationists have been seduced by the big money, just like charities. Talking to Joe last night about the charity ball, was it, that was in the news yesterday or whatever. Do the ends justify the means? Or you weren't there, were you? What? You come back all bullshit. But it's a question of what sort of a world do you want to live in. We've got short-term goals. That macaque can raise money and help deforestation reduce in a protected area. Or if you've got a long-term vision of, you know, if you've got enough money, can you do anything in this world? Yeah. So, anything else? Do we like the Papua New Guinean guy? Sorry, mate, go on.
I was just going to say I would choose the fishing to keep because it's the only one of all the pictures which benefits the many. Because a third of the world's population relies on fish, especially in the dolphin bycatchers, but if you cheat the fishery, you don't need to cheat that, but you need to eat some forage like that.
Yeah, okay. Valid kind of point. Do we like the Papua New Guinea guy? I think conservationists in general have an affinity for the older and the wiser and the indigenous people. Yeah, they form alliances with them. Maybe an over-romantic sort of view of what alliances should be like.
But isn't it just like David Attenborough collecting insects and sticking them in kill jars?
30 years ago.
At the time, it was a way of obtaining that information about the natural world and kind of studying it and understanding it.
I think that's the point of things moving on extremely quickly or whatever. I think in terms of the indigenous person and I think people, there was a general feeling 10, 20 years ago that these places were wild, remote and lawless, and the sort of people who lived there did things sort of ad hoc or whatever. I think people nowadays are realising that, you know, there is symbolism in that headdress, that this person lives in an environment where these things are relatively easy to find, whatever. There's nobody with more of an interest in terms of life and death in safeguarding their environment and the bounty that it produces than that person rather than the person above it.
I think just because it's like part of somebody's cultural heritage doesn't necessarily mean that it's right.
Okay, what are you thinking of there?
With the heritage, you know, we evolve, don't we? We move on. We might have done something in the past, but you know, looking back on it with cultural nostalgia doesn't make it right.
Yeah, that's right. Again, it's patronising and unhelpful to put these people in museums and form alliances with them, whatever. Yeah. Okay. So lots of stuff. I think lots of NGOs struggle with this baggage as well. And I think if we had this lecture in Tanzania or in Papua New Guinea, then people would be as gobsmacked at some of the things that I say as much as I was gobsmacked by the guy who wanted to develop a trade in macaques or whatever. But the official line, I suppose, comes from the global police force, or the biggest player in the international conservation community or whatever, and that's the IUCN. And they say they've got a vision of the world, rightly or wrongly, where trade in wild plants and animals will be managed at sustainable levels, the thing that Nigel said. One thing that very few students in these long debates that I have with third years and masters, very few of them mention the word sustainability. Yeah? They're on a conservation biology course. That should be foremost in their minds or whatever. But other things come out. I like bears. I don't like, I don't like farms, etc. But the official line is that they should be managed at sustainable levels in such a manner that it makes a significant contribution to human needs. The very poorest people in the world are the people who are most reliant on these sort of things. Let's not demonise them too much. Supports local and national economies and helps to motivate commitments to the conservation conservation. Right? So it's almost like a positive message that we can leverage these wildlife trades for common good in terms of money, but also to use traded wildlife to help along forest conservation and the conservation of other kinds of species. So, for example, that tree on the right-hand side has got a ladder up to it, and people take birds from nests in that tree every year. I suppose if we stop them from doing that, then the value of that tree may be reduced to its timber value only, and there's an incentive to take that timber value now rather than harvesting annually from within it. Okay? So sustainability is the key. So where are we? Where are we? The scale and the breadth of exploitation is huge, more than ever, and it may just be my Twitter, Facebook and other people that I talk to, but it's very much in your face at the moment. You know, there's sort of examples there of, there are 2 leeches on the CITES radar in terms of being overexploited. If we're living in a world where you're a leech and you're not safe from being over-harvested, then it's a pretty poor place, as is the case where poachers can break into a zoo in one of the major cities in the world, shoot a rhino and steal its horn, or take historical rhino horn and ivory from collections and museums and art galleries, etc. The medical leech is the ones that are on the radar for CITES uplisting occur in single, you know, they're endemics to single lakes in sort of central Asia and Turkey and places like that, the Caucasus. But they're being overexploited for medical purposes or whatever. We see there, it's quite easy, it's more easy now than before, I believe, to demonise to identify the enemy in these sort of trades. Yeah, David Attenborough's butterflies are in the loft, but Chinese medicine, insatiable appetites for birds and shark fins and pangolin scales are very visible, and it's not people like us that are doing it. And I think that's a really important sort of thing to understand. So Chinese and Malawian nationals arrested, people in Indonesia throwing cages of birds into the sea, drowning them, big online trade in reptiles and amphibians in Philippines, Turkish Airlines, lots of grey parrots, people being arrested. These sort of things are very quickly emerging markets, very dynamic. Things that we don't even know about can threaten species almost overnight. And one of the things, again, we're talking to Nigel about, is that bottom right-hand image, which is Santa Cruz groundnut from Polynesia. That, in that cage, is probably 2/3 of the known wild population. There's a big trade, international trade out of the Solomon Islands and those sort of areas, heading, in some cases, this whole shipment, I believe, was headed to a single individual in Qatar. Yeah? Big wildlife collectors, people want these sort of things. They can hoover up from these small islands in the Pacific in one cage full, great proportions of the populations. We didn't hear about that, or we've heard about it, and maybe we've got a PhD student starting on this exact problem later on. I think perhaps conservationists have been a bit slow to react to some of this dynamism and some of the emerging markets and the volume of trade. I would say that some of that is due to distractions and diversions elsewhere. I think if we look back 10 years ago, I think conservationists had really quite a good handle on land use change, development and overexploitation or whatever. Climate change has diversified their activities. Lots of NGOs looking for climate change money, perhaps being distracted from the growth of these sort of things. All that said, we kind of know, in many cases, how many individuals are being taken from the wild. Yeah? So we know that first statistic in terms of how many are taken from the wild population. I suppose the next most important thing we want to find out, if we're going to look at sustainability of populations, is how many there are left in the wild. Now, it's really difficult, especially when a trade becomes illegal, to keep a handle on how many are being extracted from the wild, unless there are hardly any of them left. We know how many rhinos are taken from South Africa each year, roughly, or pretty exactly. But as soon as a trade goes underground, then we start to lose our grip or our control over what is going on. Just in the same way as when drugs are illegalised, we lose control of consumption and health issues associated with those. The same with the sex industry. For the health and safety of people involved in that industry, we lose that control by turning it underground. And this is another really important thing or interesting thing about the whole subject, is that it has lots of commonalities with other things that are going on, people trafficking, etc. Those sort of racist views, whether you're a controller or you're a carrot or a stick person, how to actually control these things and for the well-being of people. But in general, we know how many of these things are being taken out from the wild. It's a lot more difficult to work out how many there are in the wild. There's a lot of remote places, a lot of tropical places, lawless places, and very, very unknown places. Some of the first sort of work on this sort of thing I did was during my PhD in Indonesia. Almost nothing was known about these populations at all. I think in general, people have underestimate how common things are in the wild. And I think with, maybe Alex should look away for the next, for this slide, but I think some of the worst people for inflating their power in terms of viewing the world are people like ornithologists, bird watchers and conservationists. Almost like we visit a forest and we see 5 of these things. It's very tempting to think that we've seen all of them. But when we look down at the map of where we've actually walked and how good we are at seeing things, we sort of realise how many places we haven't been. And in general, over the last 10, 20 years, people have found that a lot of these things are a lot more common than they are, than people believe they are. That's a very important sort of thing. We've done a lot of work with this, with various people, some of them in the audience or whatever, looking at counting birds and other wildlife, using things like distance sampling, mark recapture, roost, actual counts or whatever. Quite a lot of it on parrots, to actually just find out that basic statistic of how many there are. And some of the answers are, we'll say, quite surprising, because there is quite a lot of habitat, quite a lot of animals still there. Now, that's not always the case in terms of the Santa Cruz ground dove. There's like 12 known in the wild. But in general, on the Indonesian islands or in Brazil, there's a lot of forest, there's a lot of places we haven't been, and there's quite a lot of animals. Yeah? So, done a lot of work on that sort of thing. People are in the situation now, people really focusing on pangolins. 10 years ago, almost nobody had heard of a pangolin. Even now, most people, I believe, I daren't ask them, but most people on the pangolin specialist group, I would like to know what proportion of them have actually seen one. Anyone seen one? Have you seen one, Kat? Anybody seen a pangolin? I've been in a restaurant where it's been on the menu, but I've never seen one. How would I see one? And I will do next time I go to Africa. The first thing that I will do is make friends with a hunter, yeah? Because they see them and they catch them all the time. It's just us who can't see them, yeah? There's a huge volume of trade in pangolins and pangolin scales worldwide. There's just like whole buckets full of them being traded. These animals are coming from out of the forest. Some places are stuffed with pangolins. We just don't see them. We know very little about these wildlife populations. And the students here, you do have a chance to go and do projects that will find out conservation relevant information about the world around us. Not perhaps because you're so good and so hard working, just because so little is known. Okay? Although you might be good and hard working as well. So, let's say we know how many there are in the wild, and we know how many are taken, so we could turn it into a sort of percentage. So 1% of this population is taken per year, and 10% of that population is taken per year. But we know that animals respond differently. We know that in zoos around the world, there are people desperately trying to get animals to breed. Yeah? The last remaining individuals, to try to stop them from dying and try to make them have some babies. On the other hand, and probably in this room, there is a baited trap or poison trap set up by the company that is desperately and forever trying to get rid of mice from this building or the Arndale. Yeah? Rent-a-Kill have made a huge empire on the inability, the impossibility of getting rid of mice and rats and other vermin from our world. Yeah. So two sides of the same coin are desperately trying to keep things alive and desperately trying to kill them. So we need to know how a species, there must be differences between those species in how they react to the world that we have made for them. To look at that, we need to look at how internally they react to a given harvest. And we'll talk first of all about African grey parrots. We've spent the last 5 years or something working on several projects to do with them, with CITES, but also with two PhD students who you probably, some of you probably know, Simon Valet and Nat Anabar. We're working in two different places in Africa, but both looking at conservation relevant aspects of this species. There's enormous trade in grey parrots. It's the most significantly traded parrot in the world. Yeah? And this is the one with the grey with the red tail. There's bound to be somebody here who's got one. Or somebody got one? There's always somebody who's got one. Or got a friend who's got one. Could be captive bred, but it could have been taken out of the wild, like thousands and thousands of individuals. Okay? To understand how that multi-million-dollar trade affects the species, we have to look at the way that the babies are born, the nests are made, and the adults survive or suffer mortality or whatever. We did that with Simon through population viability analyses. Okay, so we feed into this model demographic parameters. This is another really good reason why I like talking about this to students. We've got all the political things, the racism, the lack of knowledge, the emotive issue, but it's a really good way of finding that link between the stories of wildlife trade and proper biology, which is population parameters and demographics or whatever. So birth rates, death rates, etc., etc. Okay, so we build these models, not ideal models, but population viability analyses basically have got an input and an output. You tell them how many babies are born, how many adults have died, and if one's bigger than the other, the population's going up. And if the other one's bigger than the other one, the population's going down, as you can see in those graphs. The more accurate and the better the information on those aspects of the breeding and the mortality that you put in, the better the model will be, until you get to a stage where you've got the ideal model, which sort of pathetically represents the complexity of this population. But they are workable ways of looking at how sensitive a population is to changes in its demography or changes in its wildlife. In this case, we put all these sort of things in with the grey parrot. The first graph is looking at how sensitive the parrot population is to harvests of different levels. Now, I haven't got my specs on, but the first graph, the black line is the average or best predicted trajectory of the species. So that's going up. And the grey ones are the individual simulations that you run over 50 years. With zero harvest from the wild, you get an increase. With 600, you also do. With 900, you're starting to get almost definitely, well, absolutely definitely, there's one grey line out of 1,000 that heads towards extinction. But everything is suggesting that the population's all right. increase that harvest from 900 to 1,200, and you've got almost certain extinction by the year 2044. Okay, so by changing that from 900 to 1,200 taken from the population, you've gone from everything being all right, sustainable, to almost certain loss of that species within 30 years or so. Okay? The point that we were making in this paper was that there's a fine line between success and failure in terms of harvests. Now, when we look at how harvests of wildlife are managed in Africa, in Asia, and indeed in Europe, then it's not a fine science. We've got no idea about the actual numbers taken from a national park or an island or whatever, because people are smuggling them. People are, taking them a different route. Lots of animals are dying in captivity that we don't come up on the trade figures. We are in not any position to have that precise science and management underpinning the viability of this trade. And that was one of the reasons why CITES ended up banning the trade in grey parrots. Okay? The thing on the right is to say, well, okay, we may, even if we did know the volume of trade, so we know exactly how many individuals are taken for the wild each year, it's very important what sort of individuals they are. Now, we know that parrots are long-lived. They don't have many babies. They are sort of case-selected. They're kind of a bit like us. Yeah? They mate for life-ish, and they have very few babies. They take a long time to gestate. They take a long time to mature. They don't have a big reproductive output. In species like that, it tends to be adult mortality, which is most, the population viability is most sensitive to changes in adult mortality rather than juvenile mortality or juvenile reproductive rate. So the same harvest level from here of around 1,000, if they only take chicks from the nests, then they can take 1,000 and it has no effect on the population at all. As soon as they start taking adults within the population, either through taking chicks and one of the parents, or they just randomly collect parrots, for example, when they're feeding, and they just throw a big net over them or whatever, and take adults and juveniles, then the same level of harvest can be absolutely ruinous. Okay? So as well as the fine line between success and failure in terms of sustainability, we don't just need to know how many are taken, we need to know what sort of animals are taken. 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, males, females, injured individuals, etc. It becomes extremely complicated. And sustainability pivots on that internal biology and the demographics and how the external environment treats the species. And I think a really good example is, again, for the grey parrots. We had Nat working in Ghana, and we had Simon working on the island of Principe, which is near Sao Tome in the Gulf of Guinea, the sort of armpit of Africa. Now, their situations, when they came back, couldn't have been more difficult. Nat couldn't find any. I think he found like 100 animals over the whole of Ghana in a year and a half. Simon on the island was picking them out of his hair. He was like, there were so many and the population was increasing. How can a heavily traded species like this have two very different scenarios in different parts of the world, separated by a few hundred kilometres, whatever? Okay, the biology of the species may be quite similar, but the environmental context of the two places was very different. On Principe, there was lots of forest left. Some really remote primary forests with huge trees where nobody went. Yeah? The trees that the species chose to nest in, and this is a cockatoo sort of nest, are the biggest trees in the area. On Principe, they were left alone. In Ghana, the species chosen were the preferred timber trees of the logging companies. Okay, so, and the various sort of habitat-related sort of scenarios came to pass in Ghana to make these species really struggle. So, for example, something that you perhaps wouldn't really appreciate because you're busy looking at the dead animals and you're looking at the birds in the cages and you know what the demon is. These habitat sort of features are getting a little bit away from conservationists, I think. And in this case, one of the major factors associated with the decline in the grey parrot in Ghana was a simple law laid down by the British. And that is that if you've got a farm in Ghana, you own the land, but you don't own the trees. Okay, so if you've got a huge tree with parrots and parrot nests that is a terminalia or another timber tree, then somebody can come knocking on your door and take that tree from your land. You don't want the damage associated with that, so you simply cut it down yourself. So simple accidents of law and accidents of culture, etc., can have big influences on the effect of a given trade on species. There is most definitely a habitat context to this argument. And myself and Nigel were sat in Indonesia a few months ago, and we were on one side of town, and we were talking about the Asian songbird crisis and overtrade in species. The other side of town, there was a similar meeting going on, talking about the ravages of oil palm. Yeah? We didn't talk about habitat. They didn't talk about trade. Yeah? I think a more integrated and holistic sort of and complex approach to these sort of multifaceted problems is most definitely needed. Depends on trapping patterns, not just raw volume. We need more basic biological information to inform us about these sort of things. Now, again, in the classes, I talk about demographic studies from Australia from the 1980s. Those are the best and most complete ideas of the breeding biology of parrots still. You can't get a big load of money to do a 10-year study of 100 nests or 100 sea turtle sort of beaches or whatever. It's not the sort of science that is being funded at the moment. It ain't big data and it ain't, you know, it just ain't macroecology or whatever. But these are the sort of basic informations, how the birds live, how they breed, how they die, what they eat, what they need is needed. Final thing is that local trappers are not the enemy. I think there's a general tendency to see images like people skinning things and rough-looking blokes setting snares and generally being bad to wildlife or whatever. They're the easiest people to demonise. But the most successful conservationists and conservation organisations embrace these sort of people. I think the demons and the baddies are further up these trade chains than more towards us than towards them. These are very poor, unempowered people who know an awful lot about the forest. We shouldn't be demonising them. And the image there is of Indira Widman, Peter Widman, who run in the Philippines, probably the most successful, one of the most successful bird conservation projects of my sort of career or whatever. She's been rewarded for that. She's not interested in science at all. She just works with local people, local trappers who know the best, gather, information, change people's livelihoods and lifestyles, lend them money at low interest rates, lend them hose and buy them seed, educate the kids, etc. Nothing to do with biology, nothing to do with science. It's working with local people and the baddies who become the best conservationists ever. Oh, sorry. Right, finally, sorry, we've been going on and on. Finally, I'm going to talk very briefly about some work that we're doing at the moment, and it's Kikila and the Asian songbird crisis. I don't know if people have heard of Asian songbird crisis. I think in conservation, it's one of the big sort of issues of the last 2 or 3 years or whatever. The keeping of songbirds has got a long tradition in Asia, especially in Indonesia. Java is probably the centre of, there's a lot of people there, and there's a lot of demand, and there's a lot of birds in cages and whatever. It's a tradition that is embedded in Javanese culture. A Javan man, clichéingly enough, is only complete when he has a horse, a house, a knife, a wife, and a kokila, which is a bird or a pastime, something to look after away from work or whatever, will make that person complete. The sort of kokila ideal came from, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but the reality now is very, very different. We're seeing enormous volume and diversity of birds on sale. Anybody been to a bird market? Sort of an Asian bird market is sickeningly awful to see. You know, you turn up in the morning and they're just brushing the dead birds from out of the cages and sticking them in bin bags and burning them. And it's like what Andrew Owen at Chester Zoo calls the cut flower market. You know, it's sort of like cutting flowers to give to somebody in the knowledge that it will be dead very soon. They'll be back at the market buying more and more and more of these things. Okay, so the huge volume of these sort of things and the pitiful conditions are, we find, quite sickening. It's not just birds that are caught up in this market, reptiles, all sorts of mammals. There's slow loris, which are particularly cute, especially when you've cut the teeth out of them. You know, so you turn up and they're cutting the teeth out of these and then they're selling them. The bird on the bottom left was, when I first went to Indonesia in the 1990 or whatever, was called burung hantu in Bahasa Indonesia, which means ghost bird. Yeah, so which is quite a cool name for a bird that comes out at night. Now, throughout Java, it's called Owl Harry Potter. Yeah, so every spoiled middle-class kid, I want Owl Harry Potter. I want Owl Harry Potter. Yeah, so the whole, even the cultural sort of context of this species has changed based on books and films. And there's a huge numbers of these things being drawn out of the forests and the paddy fields or whatever to satiate urban markets for these sort of things. We see extinctions of birds that should be common in the environment. They've just been slaughtered to, you know, they've just been taken to extinction. And the major sort of uplisting of species. It's not just conservation important, you know, endangered species that we're interested in. It's the loss of very common species from the environment. You go to places where you should be hearing birds and you hear nothing. Yeah? All the ecosystem function, the pollination, the seed dispersal, the pest control in the case of owls has gone from the big swathes of the environment or whatever. And the thing that people find most kind of fascinating but most weird and disturbing mostly is the level of the craze of bird singing competitions. I think that's really kind of a strange thing to do, that thousands of people congregate at the weekend in parks, etc. They bring the birds in cages and then they put them up and then they make them sing, and they have a competition and they have judges that go round and decide who is the best singer. Then you win the money, then you go to the regional contest, then you go to the national contest. Some of these birds might be worth $50,000 each, a champion, whatever. Kitjau Mania is what it's called. Individual online clubs have more than 250,000 members. These things are everywhere. Yeah? Absolutely incredible craze. Of course, feeding the demand for wild birds. Now, maybe a disaster, but I think in terms of MMU and its research, we are lucky that we are quite central to initiatives to combat these effects. There's a lot of the conservation actions and research is generated by European zoos and North American zoos. I think they should be incredibly commended for the speed and the volume of action that those zoos and EASA, etc., have produced. We're also on the Asian Songbird Trade Specialist Group. We're doing a lot of stuff there. In fact, just last night we were got a grant to look at, it's really quite a big project for making a new national park in Java to protect these sort of species. Well, we're going to finish up with two information on a couple of PhDs that are ongoing. The two guys have just gone to Indonesia, Tom Squires, you probably know, and Harry Marshall, you'll know as well. Both funded, half funded by Chester Zoo. Tom's looking at how, I call it survival ecology, how to save species on the edge of extinction due to trade. Some of these species are down to, 10 individuals in the wild, or how to reintroduce them or whatever, and how to safeguard these species until hopefully this craze is kind of over or whatever. Well, one of the interesting aspects is to look at where these species still survive. They have got a strange mix of places where you still find these birds that have been hunted out of to extinction everywhere else. So, for example, sacred temples, or military land, or areas, mines and, other industries that are guarded. The whole ecology is out of the window. They just survive in places where there is security against them being hunted. The last one is, I suppose, cutting to the heart of what the problem is. Yeah, forgetting about the birds altogether and going outside and going into the forest. We're looking at reducing demand within Java's huge captive bird market. And the reason for doing this is if we can reduce that demand, then bingo, we have on the way to solving the problem. It's sort of like cutting off the flow of blood, the loss of blood to a patient. And that is one of the most fascinating things that I've done in ages, is to look at what he's going to do is maybe 5,000 interviews with various people all over the island, supplemented by web searches and web scraping, looking at social media and trying to get information from those different sources, and then focal groups. It's quite a sort of social sort of science. And what he's found so far is that there's a whole range of, there's not just one reason why people want to exploit these birds in Java. Everybody is individual. Just the same way that you were waving your magic wands in different ways in terms of which trade to stop and which ones not to. And things that have come up, the singing competitions, the glory or the status of owning species that other people can't afford to, or owning a champion, which is the same as owning a champion racehorse here or whatever. Also, betting was illegalized in 1990 or so in Indonesia. Keeping birds and trading them and competing is a way round that law. You're not betting, you're buying stuff that could be a good investment or a bad investment. I also think that there's serious issues in terms of general sort of environment of Indonesia. These people who perhaps their parents or they were brought up in a rural environment, a sort of quite idyllic environment, are in huge metropolises now which are terrible in terms of availability of green space, general environmental conditions, and also sort of human well-being or whatever. These people crave, I think, the nostalgia of green spaces, etc. They also keep birds in cages to save them from the ravages of the wild. Yeah? They say, big problems in Indonesia and places in Borneo with massive forest fires. These people really do believe that buying a bird from a market and keeping it in a cage will keep it safer than their government can keep them in the wild, whatever. So the lack of confidence in the government's ability to manage the environment, people are taking these things in and killing them. Yeah? Also just connections between people. These people here, the first thing to do when you get married or you get a girlfriend or whatever in Indonesia is to buy a white bird. Yeah? It shows how much your love will last or whatever. Yeah? The zebra doves there, over 800 years of tradition, that a zebra dove, if you buy the right zebra dove, it can warn you of black magic against you. You buy the zebra dove, you count the number of feathers on its breast. If that number of feathers is the correct number, then that bird will warn you if somebody's trying to poison you, trying to make your business fail, and whatever. That's so deep-seated in Indonesian culture that it's a thing that's shared between Muslims, Christians and Buddhists. It's that old that it's not even segregated by religion. The last thing, what's people doing there? They're going out into green spaces with the birds and letting them fly. Yeah? And the person who wins is the person whose bird comes back last, whatever. Yeah? It's like it's a kind of weird thing to do, like merit releases in Buddhist and in other cultures. People buy stuff, buy animals from the market and release them into the wild and therefore get some religious sort of penance for it. Yeah? People go and collect those animals, put them back in the market, and it's a whole sort of industry. Okay, I'm sorry I've gone on too long, but one of the aims of all this research, I think, is to find those ways, those pragmatic ways. We don't not like people. We're working with people to find best solutions who get through these struggles. I don't think personally that there is a huge gulf between people enjoying the environment in a way that we would see as wholesome and the right-hand image of people smuggling birds. Now, I don't know if people have seen that image, but myself and Nigel and other people had a meeting with the Environment Minister in Indonesia, wherever it was, and she said it would be political suicide for us to close down the bird markets. It's so intrinsic part of people's culture. But we don't want to see that sort of image from our country coming out in the international sort of arena or whatever. There's a cockatoo being smuggled in a plastic thing. So we've got lots and lots of work to do. But finally, I'd like to, I haven't got time to thank all the people who have helped us do all this stuff over the years. So I haven't thanked anybody or put any logos on. But I think it sort of sums it up. That's an email that I sent to PhD students and collaborators over the years when they made us a professor, whenever it was, 18 months ago or whatever. I think it kind of sums it all up. So thank you.
There is a reception outside afterwards, but I think if Stuart is willing, there's time for a few questions.
Yeah. So, Michael.
Thank you for that. Just want to ask, in terms of the attitudes to people's attitudes towards animals, is there some element of empathy or lack of empathy or a different approach to empathy with kind of Asian countries, Western countries, in terms of how they handle these animals, how they deal with these animals? I'm not just talking about the bird trade, but in terms of how they look at these animals as sentient beings.
Okay.
Is that an impact? Does that have an impact?
I think that's a kind of question that I might want to answer quite carefully, I think. But I think I know what you mean, and I think, and I don't think it's just wildlife reactions. It could be approaches to each other as well. I think Java is quite. Forgive me if anyone's from Java or whatever, but I find it an unusual place. I've been to a lot of places in the world, and it's a tiny bit different in some sort of respect. Whether people find these things sentient, I think some people do and some people don't. Yeah, people that I've spoke to said this animal, it's his, life and joy or whatever. Also, the connections between grandfather and I think there's not enough people think of them as sentient. kind of things. They are objects to be traded and objects to be to be competed with. Yeah, and probably the most interesting thing that somebody said to us was like somebody last year was sort of saying, well, you're talking about all these bird competitions or whatever. He went to a shopping mall in Java, and people had rented out a whole floor of a multi-storey car park, and they were racing scale electric cars, right, for trophies. And there were 3,000 or 4,000 men racing scale electric cars for money, glory, and whatever. I think in some people's eyes, the birds is not the important thing. It's the vehicle by which you do it. It may as well be a scale electric car or whatever. I think in other people, it's an absolute joy for them. But I think more important than that, probably the actual holding and the holding and the caring, because these people take a long, long time in their lives looking after their birds. They love it, yeah, sentient or not. But I think that craving for a better environment, I think, we talk about green space and ability to find wild birds in the vicinity. I think that's out of the window in a lot of these places. And I think that's probably one of the changes that you'd want to make, yeah? Because keeping a bird in a cage to having a bird in a garden, is it such a big step? That's what I don't understand, but hopefully Ari will find out. Yeah.
Just following on from that, do you think zoos could have a role in helping this? I've had a lot of bad press lately, but the zoos try to build some of this empathy towards animals.
Well, the general empathy towards animals, I think that's right, isn't it? Isn't that what a lot of research is showing or trying to show is, the conservation knowledge, empathy, just experience of these sort of things, and the snottier the kids and the perhaps not for middle class folks who get the chance to go places, but I think the snottier the kid in a zoo, the more beautiful it is. But I think in terms of empathy, yeah, that's right. But I think in terms of conservation action, in terms of both breeding, the last individuals of a species to stop it going extinct, and to funding and outreach into sort of conservation relevant thing, I think the zoos are winning hands down, aren't they, at the moment in this sort of issue? Yeah, rightly or wrongly. Megan?
I was really conscious when you were talking about taking the teeth out of the little animal and so on. You know what? All I could think about was declawing cats that we're allowed to do. And I wondered, taking on from the first question you had, whether in the countries that you've been in, it seems hypocritical that people come in from the West, if you like, and say, well, you can't, you shouldn't be doing this, while we're doing sort of big farming and
yeah, I think it's totally hypocritical, and I think that's one of the great things of talking about these sort of issues is that colonialism and racism and just sort of arrogance are at the forefront of a lot of what's going on, as well as personal taste or ethics or whatever. Pulling the teeth out of a slow loris so you can cuddle it, get closer to it. Yeah, I don't know, but I bet people will remember that image. Joe?
I was just wondering how many of the conservation projects around the world contribute something back to the local people that they're presumably in contact with through educating them about the work that's going on?
An increasing number, I think, or an increasing number of successful ones. Are you talking about, I think you've got to be careful when you talk about educating them in terms of, are we educating them in terms of, almost like missionaries or whatever? I think understanding their livelihoods and that.
Yeah, but educating them in the sense that you're explaining what you're doing and why you're doing it, and hopefully part of that will generate some understanding from people then about the importance of the work you're doing.
Yeah.
It might then help.
I think the best conservation organisations have gone beyond that and asking local communities what they want, yeah, and whether it fits in with, you know, like in terms of the lass who won the award or whatever. They're just fantastic, you know. They're not doing much conservation. They're not doing any preaching. They're just helping the livelihoods of people and employing ex-parrot trappers to be wildlife guards and wildlife guardians. Yeah, you know, these are the best people who do these things. They just need some help, and you know, they don't need preaching to, and they certainly don't want to end up thinking like we're thinking. Yeah, so. Ole, yeah.
On that note, in one of your slides, you made quite a strong argument for needing more biological knowledge, but then the example you gave of one of the best conservation actions was someone that doesn't use science or biological knowledge.
Yeah,
so it seems like a disconnect there.
Yeah, well, I think, well, it depends what the situation is, whatever. You know, I think in terms of the way that the Catella Foundation work is, it's relatively simple. These birds were just all being caught, and they'd been caught everywhere else, and there was a remnant population. Now, they don't know the intricacies of you know, whether there are enough nests or what's going to happen next or whatever. But I think in terms of, yeah, I take your point, but maybe it's some sort of luck. But I think if you've got a species that is being traded to extinction everywhere, and you've got an island and you stop all forms of trapping because you employ the trappers, then unless you get it wrong and it's not that, then you're kind of on the right sort of path. Where that trajectory is going to go, because you don't know if there are enough nest trees or whether there's sort of disease in the population or whether the demographics are right. I think their approach was, we're going to do something, we're going to stop that loss of blood and see what sort of happens and react to that sort of thing. Yeah, I think other biological populations across Ghana or whatever need a bit more investigation or whatever. Yeah, well, let's not investigate it too much and then turn around and it's all gone. I think that's the sentiment. Yeah. So.
Is there any research on like cat and dog ownership in the UK? It seems like there's not much difference to owning a cat and let it go out and potentially kill birds and small animals and eat cat food, which is quite unsustainable, or letting your dog off on the beach with nesting birds. So there's other stuff going on.
I bet there is, isn't there? Anybody know about cat and dog ownership? We know how many birds they kill, or we've got an estimate of those sort of things. We know how much food, we know the carbon footprint of our dogs. We also know the health and mental, you know, physical and mental health well-beings of having dogs, or, you know, in terms of companionship and exercise and just well-being or whatever. Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of people doing that. Anybody know behave, Robin? I nearly brought my dog here.
In terms of cats, I think there was an overestimation of the bird kill and small mammal kill out there, and it was measured by the gifts that these cats were given their owners. But I don't think it had the impact that people believe in. Birds are cats are too lazy to eat, they're too well fed.
2 billion birds, yes, in the States.
In the US?
Yeah.
We're probably feeling better over there.
4%. It's like 4% of native Australian wildlife is killed every year by cats.
Like 4% per year is killed by a cat. So yeah. So.
Can I, sorry, just one last question. When I moved up here about nearly 10 years ago, I noticed a flock of green-necked parakeets. And there's only a tiny little flock of green-necked parakeets, just on Platteview Farm. Now it's massive, they're all over the place. Has anyone looked at the impact they're having on the local bird population in terms of competition for nesting sites or even food sources?
I don't think here, not in Manchester, you talk about Manchester or whatever, but there is a lot of concern about ring-necked parakeets in the studies in Belgium and London, about potential negative impacts on other hole nesting birds. Things like nuthatches have been mentioned, even stock doves and things like that, or competition for food or whatever, or you know, sort of aggression at bird tables. I think, yeah. How do we get onto that? I think it depends which way you look at it. I think, you know, again, it's an urban area. I would like some inner city kids to be able to see those sort of birds rather than see none. Yeah, I think, you know, it's not a huge deal, but somebody might say otherwise. Okay, are they the enemy or the good ones?
No, we do. I think sort of like kids to experience things like people
I think in general, any connection between wildlife, environment and people, however sort of seemingly distasteful it is, I think it has got a value. Because the alternative in central Manila or Bangkok or Mexico City or Jakarta is a total disconnection and cultural loss of wildlife from people's psyches. Now, whether that can be restored or not is, but I think any of those sort of things is has got some sort of value. Okay.
Including grey squirrel.
Grey squirrel?
The debate's still ongoing about the parakeets. I mean, there's some suggestion that that caused some damage to the fruit, various of the fruits and places, but generally speaking, it seems to me that conservation organisations hold grey squirrels, they abhor grey squirrels basically. I mean, there was a wildlife trust came in for a fairly vitriolic campaign online for its position on control of grey squirrel population. What do you think about that?
What from people who didn't like the idea of culling these things? Yeah. Just sort of killing, but with some legitimacy. Yeah. Still with some sort of conservation justifications, which I find attractive but uncomfortable at the same time. It's that provocative. But again, it's it's killing stuff in it, and that's something that's very close to people's hearts. Okay, cheers.
So I think there is a bit of a reception out front if you care to join Stuart there, but if we can thank him once again for an absolutely excellent